Hello. Thanks for coming. I think we thought that maybe we would read from our books this evening. Alex is going to read from Motherdom first, start talking, and then at some opportune moment, which will surely present itself, I'll read from mine.
Brilliant.
Take it away.
Helen. Hi everyone, good evening. Can you hear me okay? Is the mic working? Brilliant. Okay, so I'm just going to read a bit from the introduction of my book, which explains, I guess, what the book's about. So good mother myths is one of the sort of central themes, obviously, of the book. So I'll start off reading about that. Good mother myths find mothers at fault, however they raise their children. As Rich memorably observed, the institution of motherhood finds all mothers more or less guilty of having failed their children. I'm sorry, I've got a real frog in my throat. Excuse me. The writer Jacqueline Rose describes motherhood as the ultimate scapegoat for our personal and political failings, for everything that is wrong with the world, which it becomes the task, unrealisable, of course, of mothers to repair. Mother blame is deemed socially acceptable, even desirable, as mothers make convenient scapegoats for all manner of societal ills. Marginalised mothers are particularly susceptible to scrutiny and censure. Vulnerable groups make easier targets. Mothers are blamed for problems both substantial and small scale. For instance, racial inequalities and babies' eczema are both mothers' fault, according to two influential publications which appeared in 1965. The Moynihan Report, which examined the causes of black poverty in the US, claimed that the matriarchal structure of black families seriously retards the progress of the group as a whole and imposes a crushing burden on the Negro male. In The First Year of Life, published in the same year, the psychoanalyst Rennie Spitz linked specific infant ailments to maternal attitudes. So, eczema is caused by hostility in the guise of manifest anxiety, while 3-month colic is down to primary anxious over permissiveness. Mother blame has perhaps never been so precise. Perhaps the most painful element of good mother myths is that they draw their power from women's love and care. A key mechanism in ensuring mothers conform to good mother myths is dire warnings that they will damage their children. Being a bad mother is not just a matter of social humiliation, it means we are imperiling our children. These threats are immensely powerful, deployed to tell mothers what they can and cannot do and shame them into compliance. The cruelest good mother myths hold women responsible for the deaths of their children. The writer and medical ethicist Harriet Washington recounts how James Marion Sims, the physician infamous for conducting experiments on female slaves without anaesthesia, blamed enslaved mothers for the high death rates of their infants. He said of neonatal tetanus, which is caused by a bacterial infection, wherever there are poverty and filth and laziness, or where the intellectual capacity is cramped, the moral and social feelings blurred, there it will be oftener found. A more recent example is women who endured appalling maternity care at the Shrewsbury and Telford Hospital NHS Trust, being made to feel responsible for the death of their babies. A review into the needless deaths and injuries of babies and mothers highlighted correspondence and documentation which often focus on blaming the mothers, rather than considering objectively the systems, structures and processes underpinning maternity services at the Trust. Father blame is a much rarer phenomenon because mothers and fathers are held to very different standards. Mothers operate under a deficit model in which any shortcomings or faults are criticised. Fathers, on the other hand, benefit from a credit model where they're praised for anything they do. Indeed, the only common negative father stereotype is the deadbeat dad who is completely absent. As the comedian Ali Wong put it, it takes so little to be considered a great dad, and it also takes so little to be considered a shitty mom. The writer Sarah Maitland observed that her husband got so much praise and psychic support for doing simple things which, had I not done them, would have been considered gross inadequacy in me. The philosopher Kate Mann's brilliantly argued book, Down Girl, which is on the shelves there, but I noticed earlier, The Logic of Misogyny, explains why this is the case. Women are deemed to be givers of emotional, social, sexual, domestic and reproductive labour. We nurture, we soothe, we sympathise, we listen, we admire, we comfort, we submit ourselves. And women are not only supposed to be givers, but required, in the words of Mann, to give in a loving and caring manner or enthusiastic spirit. Men, on the other hand, are expected and entitled to be takers of power, prestige, public recognition, rank, reputation, honour, face, respect, money, and other forms of wealth. A mother-child dynamic underpins men's status as takers. The writer Siri Hutsford observes, All women are expected to act on this cultural imperative. The absurd demand that I, the woman, exist only for you, the eternal man-child, to soothe, placate, feed, hold, admire and adore you. And if I do not perform this part to your full satisfaction, I am a spoiled, wicked, heartless bitch, a witch.
Thank you so much for reading that. I guess what that passage in your book always makes me think of, not least, I guess, because you actually cite Jacqueline Rose, who's a kind of, a lodestar for me, and I know for many others who work on motherhood, is this idea, I guess, that you're laying out and displaying with the examples that you choose of how the collective, raising children, which is and should be a collective responsibility. All of the responsibility and kind of blame for it is displaced onto the individual, right? It's the duty, the fault of the individual mother to raise the child right, and very rarely get any praise for for doing so, for succeeding. But in Jacqueline Rose's book, Mothers, she suggests that it's because this country is run by former public school boys that there's this kind of early infant and childhood kind of experience of neglect that instills a kind of total horror of dependence. And I've always liked that because it kind of emphasizes, I think, the kind of irrational violence or kind of will to punish that is beneath the way that motherhood is kind of demonized and treated in the UK and elsewhere. But maybe we can think about the UK specifically for now.
No, absolutely. And I think that's one of the things you've written about is the idea of the nanny state and this figure of the nanny, this kind of ambivalent figure, the sort of nurturing, but the figure that and I think that idea of moral outrage, which Siri Hutsford writes about as well, I think is a really important part of how motherhood is seen and treated, and just this complete taking for granted of maternal labour. And if mothers step out of line in any way, there is that kind of moral outrage that's experienced. But as you say, that kind of ambivalence about dependence as well. So there's a lot to unpack, I think.
And in that way, I guess the mother and the infant are understood to be everyone's business. Like literally business, I mean, kind of financially and economically, but also kind of public property. But the flip side of that should be some form of public support or collective support, structural support, and that is completely absent. So there's a sense that it's a kind of radically unfair or imbalanced sort of form of public life.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, the thing which that I always quote from this book is about sort of children in this country going to bed hungry, and I just think we're the 6th largest economy in the world, and children in this country go to bed hungry, and I just can't square those two things in my head, because if bringing up children is a communal public activity, which I believe it is, then why are children going to bed hungry? And that's just putting it in the simplest possible terms. But what mothers are expected to do in terms of bringing up children, and that lack of support, which starts right from birth, the way in which we birth and the kind of care we get. So right from the start, there is a lack of support, a lack of resources, a lack of respect that start, right from the start of motherhood.
Yeah, absolutely. And also the kind of, I feel like, I don't know if you feel like this, but and I know we've both been working on motherhood for a long time, which can kind of drive you crazy sometimes. Like you kind of feel like everywhere you look, you're just seeing like more kind of hypocrisies, which is the thing that really I find difficult is how hypocritical the discourse around mothering and motherhood is. And another example of that is this kind of constant, at the moment, right-wing panic about the birth rate, right? Yeah. This idea that young women are not having children and they're so selfish for not doing that, with no willingness to look at the reasons why that might be, like the housing crisis, or the climate crisis, or all these multiple crises. But also that on the flip side, there's this total policing of who gets to have a child. So what the right-wing press and the centrist press, and also our government, as well as everything's right-wing now, I guess, it feels, are doing is that they're saying the right kind of women, and they do mean women, aren't becoming mothers.
Yeah.
As well as kind of just every kind of possible way that someone who doesn't have citizenship in the UK might want to give birth and be supported to mother, or, you know, lesbians who want to be assisted through IVF processes without kind of having to go through all these specific, kind of geographically specific hoops to jump through. They're kind of stymied at every turn, which is another kind of, I guess, it's the good mother myth as a kind of productive force, like it's making good mothers. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think one of the dynamics in all of that I'm really interested in, which I've written about, is what I've called unmothering. So people having their children removed from them. And I think that is part of all of that as well, that, you know, we have this figure of the good mother and everyone else, you know, and if you're a bad mother, then you don't deserve to you know, if you're a potential bad mother, you don't deserve to have a child. And if you're an actual bad mother, then you can have your child taken away from you. And I think that's the way in which good mother myths are so pernicious in terms of people's lives. So, yeah, you know, there can be a lot of guilt and misery, but there's just the suffering caused by people unfairly having their children taken away from them because there's not the resources there to support them. And I think, I mean, I've written about the sort of forced adoption scandal, when we can look back on that and go, oh, wasn't that terrible? We had people had their babies taken away because they were unmarried, or wasn't that terrible? But, you know, people are still unfairly having their babies taken away from them. That is still happening. And I just think, again, it's just, given the richness and resources we have in this country, that we cannot, we allow that to happen. But it is very much to do with, who is good. And, all those groups, you know, migrant women, they're not good, you know, they're not good mothers, so they don't get that support.
And also, I think, I was reading today on the train here a story about increased police searches in the instances of pregnancy loss. I don't know if you've seen this
I know,
story.
it's just like...
So a kind of, you know, that they're now under I think it's under safeguarding laws, as far as I understand. I may be garbling this, and I was literally reading this just earlier. But in the case of a lost pregnancy now, the police can investigate things like knowledge of the condition and intention in the person who's miscarried. So again, we have this desire to kind of roll back reproductive rights and kind of enforce pregnancy in certain groups that also kind of, I think, I mean, reproductive rights is at the bottom of all good mother myths in some ways, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's happening, particularly in the US, around reproductive rights, it is very much this idea of the good mother. The good mother will die of sepsis in a car park because, you know, no sacrifice is too great. And I think the most enduring and the most powerful good mother myth is this idea of self-sacrifice. And when it comes to reproductive rights, you know, no sacrifice is great enough. And the way in which that's playing out in the US is just horrific. And when you have stories like, and I saw that story as well here, you just think, you know, please, can we not have anything like that happening in the UK? But that discourse around very rigid gender roles, what's natural, that is really making a comeback. And I think that's part of this whole sort of right-wing backlash we're seeing against all sorts of, you know, against feminist rights, against trans people. It's all kind of situated in this idea of women and men's natural roles. And yeah, just hearing that language making such a comeback is pretty horrible.
I mean, I write so much about Margaret Thatcher.
I really wanted to talk to you about Margaret Thatcher.
I was thinking, I can see her like crying face up there because it's on the cover of The Party's Over by Phil Burton Clatlish, which is a great book, but like it's actually kind of soothing me in some way. I'm like, cry. But I mean, so I write about her in the book because it begins in 1970 and it comes up to the present. So a huge amount of that time is when Margaret Thatcher is in office. And then after that, I guess I argue that everything that's come after is still kind of coloured by her. She's the kind of mother of what's come after, in some pretty horrifying ways. But Section 28 is really crucial to that. And in the recent attacks on trans rights in the Supreme Court and the kind of discourse around it, the language is basically the same as the language that was being employed during kind of in support of Section 28 in the 1980s. And, you know, under the guise of making things easier for lesbians, which is the stupidest thing I've ever heard. It's like, for who? But it feels like those kind of divisions, I suppose, that used to be legally encoded between, you know, the good mothers and bad mothers and real families and fake families. Kind of coming back. Because Section 28 was about pretend family life. Like that was what Thatcher had this kind of huge obsession with.
And this whole sort of this concept of woke that gets thrown about, and that's used as a sort of battering ram, isn't it, against to like, you know, natural again families, proper men, proper women. And this sort of biological essentialism, which I think the Supreme Court judgment really sparked all that off. And you had people going, yay, biology. You just think, how can you be a feminist and go, yay, biology? I mean, I don't know.
Yeah. And it's interesting, right, again, when you work on motherhood and mothering, which is also often used as a kind of Trojan horse for some kind of small c conservative ideas, right? Even amongst people who would describe themselves as being on the left, which is interesting. And I think I've certainly found, and I'd be interested to know if you have, that sometimes when you say you're working on motherhood or you're thinking about motherhood or mothering, people assume that you're working on like biological sex or something, or that you have this really particular idea of motherhood as constitutive of womanhood or vice versa. Because I think that the kind of limited public space that's afforded to discussions of motherhood often mean that it gets kind of squidged in this kind of weird feminist broad brushstrokes way.
I completely agree. And I think also the way in which sort of motherhood gets reduced to flexible working and, you know, and things which I think are important. But it is much broader than that. And I think one of the things which I've written about in terms of good mother myths is I think that the maternal figure afflicts all women, because that expectation that we're all supposed to be kind of nurturing and caring and you just see it in so, you know, sort of work situations and family situations, you know, who's making the tea, who's planning the social events, who's doing all that kind of care work in the workplace, in sort of social circles. It is that assumption that we are going to mother as women, which I think is, and it comes back to this idea of, you know, women are naturally nurturing and all these very, very reductive ideas of what women and people are about. So yeah, I think it's been very sort of two-dimensional, you know, discussion of motherhood. Completely agree.
And again, that works both ways. I feel like that's all I ever say. It actually works both ways. It's actually fascinating. It's a double-sided issue. But, you know, if you are perceived to be a woman of childbearing age who could have a child, then maternal discrimination, for example, in the workplace will apply to you too. I mean, not, I guess, in relation to maternity leave, but in relation to kind of hiring practice, for example. You know, if you seem like you're a woman in your early 30s, you seem like you're a woman in your early 30s, and people will choose to discriminate against you on those grounds if they want to. But also, it's I guess the way that then this kind of lost my chain of thought. It was a two-sided issue, and I just remembered one side. So the discrimination applies to you whether or not you have a child.
Why don't you read from your book?
Yeah, that's a great idea. I actually wrote down all of my thoughts in this handy hardback form. I am going to read from a section that comes quite close to the beginning of the book. It's the beginning of the introduction. I might stand up to read, if that's not too much, just because I can't see anyone and it makes me feel a little bit weird. Okay, that's better. So the introduction is called Hysterical History. And it begins with an epigraph, which I'll read, which is from Doris Lessing's Walking in the Shade. I have been tempted to write a chapter headed Politics, so that it could be skipped by people who find the whole subject boring, but politics permeated everything. Motherhood is a political state. Nurture, care, the creation of human life, all immediate associations with mothering, have more to do with power, status, and the distribution of resources, both by mothers and for them, than we like to admit. For raising children is the foundational work of society, and from gestation onward, it is unequally shared. Political maternity has two parts. First, the social and cultural context that mothers exist within and are constrained by, the way things are, and second, the expansive possibilities of reorganising these structures, the way things could be. Acknowledging that motherhood is inherently political helps us identify precisely who benefits from the status quo, a government and an economy reliant on the denial of collective responsibility. It is also the first concrete step toward liberating mothers from their current position, where so much is expected of them and so little provided. There is a crucial difference between the recognition that all motherhood is political and the politicisation of motherhood for particular ends. The former is an emancipatory tool. The latter reduces the mother to a weapon to be deployed in someone else's argument. Motherhood has been put to work over the course of the last 50 years and before them by many conservative ideologies, in headlines, in policy making, and in cultural representation. Bad mothers are too poor, the wrong race, the wrong sexuality, the wrong gender. They have the wrong politics, the wrong housing, the wrong reasons for being mothers at all. The good mother, on the other hand, is a conveniently wholesome container. She brings a certain sympathetic quality, that feminine touch, to whatever doctrine is poured into her, but she exists firmly outside the realm of the political itself. There have been recent attempts to make motherhood visible as a political issue. As the popularisation of liberal feminism reshaped the mainstream in the 2010s, mothering became something of a zeitgeist topic, but this has mostly been limited to a very particular set of concerns relating to middle-class mothers who work, whether through the frequent positioning of motherhood as an opposite to the creative vocation of being a writer or an artist, or simply a concern with making capitalism function better for such women. To fight for fair employment practices for mothers is, of course, fundamentally political. Motherhood has long been the leading factor in gendered inequality in the workplace. Oh, I've remembered what I was going to say. This operates at both a literal and a conceptual level. Whatever your personal circumstances, if you're perceived by your boss to be a woman of childbearing age, the risk of discrimination applies to you too. Yet to focus on isolated, politicised moments, when childcare becomes difficult to balance with work commitments, for example, or when breastfeeding is understood as a public faux pas, falls short of understanding motherhood in its entirety. Such isolated campaigns, however worthwhile, still position the public and the private as separate spheres, coming into contact via the experiences of individuals who have children, suggesting that motherhood becomes political only at these moments of contact with civil society. This became particularly clear during the COVID-19 pandemic, when lockdown, in contracting all public life to the home, temporarily dissolved the boundaries between the two. The dominant view of mothering in contemporary discourse, both culturally and politically, is that it belongs to the domestic realm, where it can be conveniently ignored. This both seriously limits the imaginative possibilities of what mothers can be and obscures the real, complex history of public maternity in the 20th and 21st centuries. The mothering that happens in these chapters, from the 1970s to the 2010s, takes place in comfortable homes, in glossy magazines and reality TV shows, in prisons, in protest camps, in squats, on picket lines, in hospitals and on public transport. To declare motherhood an entirely political state is to claim back territory for ourselves. So that's the book. You don't need to read it now.
But I think it's so interesting what you read there about this kind of emancipatory potential of motherhood. And I think that's one of the things about writing about motherhood is it's like, oh God, must you be so gloomy? It's like, well, yeah, because it's really crap. But there's also that kind of, that other side to it of saying, actually, there is that potential there. So it's really interesting that, that passage you just read, which kind of touches upon that.
Yeah, I think it's, I guess if we think of, well, I like to try and focus on ambivalence as a kind of specifically maternal quality. You know, two things can be true at once. Or motherhood is a kind of incredibly complicated collection of mixed feelings, as well as a kind of collection of actions and habits, rather than kind of one role or one identity category, I guess. And in the book, I really wanted to, and maybe we can talk about birth, actually. But in writing about birth, obviously, you're writing about structural inequalities in healthcare provision, the kind of midwifery crisis in the NHS. You're writing about kind of the discrimination that happens in birth choices, all of these things. But I also wanted to keep some space for writing about the kind of profound emotional, intellectual, philosophical aspects of childbirth as an experience too, because you don't have to choose. You know, it can be something that is you know, kind of conceptually overwhelming, discombobulating. Alice Notley, one of my favourite poets who died yesterday, describes in her poem "A Baby is Born Out of a White Owl's Forehead," 1972. The experience of giving birth as obliterating herself. But she doesn't mean in a negative sense necessarily. So she kind of deals with this like total obliteration and sees what's left afterwards, what's left at the end, to kind of make something new. And I wanted to keep those experiences in the book alongside things like all the statistics about kind of maternal care in crisis. I mean, it's maybe not necessarily optimistic, but it's at least, I guess, affective or significant in its in prioritizing people's experiences of birth and saying these are important too.
Yeah, I think birth is so important. It matters. It's a sort of profoundly important experience in people's lives, and we're letting people down. I mean, poor Donna Ockendon's doing yet another review. You just think, you know, how many reviews is she going to have to do? And we know what. And what's really frustrating about it is we know what the problems are and we know what the solutions are, and it comes down to, a lot of it comes down to resources, so resource it properly. But also you do need that kind of systematic change as well, where you're putting women and birthing people at the centre of maternity care, and that just isn't happening at the moment at all. I mean, one of my sort of personal experiences, which has sort of informed the writing of the book, is I've worked as a postnatal practitioner with NCT for over a decade, and so done lots of groups with new mothers, and it's just so depressing year after year. And it's not just the birth experience, but it's also afterwards, like, oh, I really wanted a glass of water, or I was in pain and no one gave me any pain relief, or all of that. And it's just like, even just that simple kindness that people need after, you know, it's a big deal. You need to be looked after. And the way in which our healthcare system is working at the moment, that just doesn't happen nearly often enough. And I think also for people working in maternity care, and I know people who do, and then just not able to give the kind of care they want to give because of the lack of resources, because the way the system works, you know, and it's not working for anybody. And I think it's just makes me really sad that people are not having those experiences of birth that they could and should, however they want to birth. I mean, I think there's a huge amount of moralising around birth, about what type of birth you have, and I think that is really problematic. And I think we should have a much more sort of person-centred approach to birth and continuity of care, like meeting when you give birth, meeting the person that's going to be there with you, not just some random person you've never met before. And that's one way in which I think, again, we really let people down. I mean, I've got a whole chapter as well on infant feeding. That's another sort of issue where I just see, so over the years, again, just see so much kind of distress and sadness and frustration. And again, moralising as well around feed. I think feeding is a real feminist issue. I think we should just say to people, it's up to you how you feed your baby. It really is. If you want to breastfeed, you should be able to get support, and that support is really important, and it can make a real difference. But, you know, we really set people up to fail we say you should birth this way, you should feed this way, and then we don't give them the support or the resources to be able to do that. It's terrible.
Yeah. I work as a birth companion. Again, I guess. General, the kind of what the they're not. Lots of kind of I found it interesting, which I was write about.
However they want to. Moralising around. Continuity of care, like
I recognise that, or I guess kind of stereotypically it is.
That's one way. I've got a whole chapter as well on
births.
Over the years.
That's particular
Stress and
work out how
again moral.
agent, safe, things like this. Set up in some unideal place, which I agree. I work as a a birth companion, as well as a kind of postnatal.
And I think
for
and I think exactly
Amma,
that
which is based in Glasgow.
Things being explained,
again,
actual consent. Just knowing, having some sort of relationship with the people
for me,
you're birthing
wards,
with, I think is really important.
Amma works almost entirely
and
with
that just is not
expectant
right
mothers
now.
in the asylum system.
And I mean, the cesarean section rate in England at the moment is 42%, which is
general,
really
kind
high.
Of so around things like what the private companies
someone
that the
I was talking
government outsources asylum housing to.
Had a baby quite recently, just said no one told me that might happen. So I wish I'd just known that there was actually like a 1 in 5 chance I might have a cesarean section
that don't get sorted, or they're 3 flights of stairs up and you can't carry a buggy.
And I think that's part of my beef as well around sort of birth and feeding, is that we sort of treat
kind of intersecting factors,
women like babies. Like, no, we can't say that this might happen or that might happen.
And it's interesting
because we're trying to push them down a particular path, and we kind of infantilise mothers a lot
as a birth partner
in all sorts of ways, which again I think going back to your point about agency, we're not giving people any agency because we're like, no, we're not going to tell you this. We're, la la la.
Yeah, Yania Escobar, you quote, who she says, I feel like a lot of the training as a doula focuses on talking people out of getting epidurals, using labour augmenting drugs, or getting a cesarean section. And I recognise that. I think that's present sometimes in doula training. Or I guess kind of stereotypically it is. But the thing that's been very interesting about being a birth partner in specifically a hospital setting, and specifically a highly medicalised, in the context of highly medicalised births, that's particularly interesting, the kind of way that you have to work out how you can prioritise things like agency and consent, safety, the provision of translators, things like this, in a setting that's kind of always been set up in some ways as an unideal way to give birth, or an unideal place, which is not true, right? I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be true that there's any one kind of birth that is the right one for whichever person. It's about agency and consent from the birthing person, always, in response to changing situations that need to be clearly explained, which they often aren't.
I don't exactly,
absolutely.
I think they explain
adult sexuality, Venn diagram.
Some sort of and I think that's true for feeding as well. That's why we've got so there's very weird, like if someone's feeding in public, it's like, oh, you're a flasher, you're an exhibitionist. It's like, no, they're just feeding their baby. They're just like, and so we have very, very odd attitudes around feeding, I think.
Yeah, and
I known that
representation
Mm.
and also experience.
I think that's part of
that was understood.
like, no, we can't say that this might happen or that might happen. Kind of infant.
But now that feels like
it's completely taboo. Yeah.
Infantilization.
Again, the kind of the psychoanalyst in me thinks that that's because it would be too scary to understand mothers as adults with agency as political subjects, I guess. I think, or that's what I'm arguing, but also as sexual subjects. And I think that's interesting when we think about conversations about sex after birth,
somehow.
About things like what happens after a C-section, what happens, if you have to have an episiotomy, what happens if you have a uterine prolapse, or, sexual life, erotic life, whatever form that takes for you.
It's also economic.
Well, it's firstly always assumed to be exactly the same kind. The amount of times I've heard midwives say, someone who wants to try and induce labour, oh, you should have sex, but they won't say that because it's like too scary, so you have to say it in a kind of twee way. They'll say, well, it helps the baby get in there, helps it get out, and it's like, well, that's not always how a baby gets in there, actually. And also what actually induces labour is orgasm, and that's definitely not what always has to happen for someone to get pregnant. So, but there's this sense that you absolutely cannot let adult sexuality into like the Venn diagram of kind of what it is to be a mother, what it means to be a mother.
And I think one of the issues around infant feeding is the formula companies just are never going to play nice. They're there to sell products, and so the way in which
So we have
the way in which they do that. I mean, it's very exploitative in terms of the marketing, and now here's an expensive kind of form of formula.
But again, I mean,
also kind of subtly undermining breastfeeding as well. And so you have, it's almost like you have these sort of two camps. It's really difficult because I think there can be so much sort of shame and guilt around
breastfeeding as an erotic experience.
But the people who are very sort of strong proponents of feeding have had also years of battling with formula companies. So I kind of understand where they're coming from, but from the perspective of an individual person, that can just cause so much guilt as well. So it's really, really difficult. I mean, I think with formula, I just think formula shouldn't be a commercial product. I think it's it's necessary and we need to have it, but the idea of
infantilization,
money being made off the back of it is just really offensive, and it's one of the reasons why there's so many issues around infant feeding, I think.
And even if we think about the kind of history of breastfeeding, which is fascinating, in the 18th century, there are all these kind of trends in breastfeeding. The idea was very prevalent that negative character traits for the mother could be transmitted to an infant through the milk, which was also understood to be menstrual blood that had just turned white somehow. But then in the 18th and 19th centuries, it became a capitalist trade, basically, with wet nursing and things like this. So, if we think about feeding as something that's political, it's also economic. So in the 18th and 19th centuries, you have this system in which working class women would often end up selling their milk as wet nurses for more affluent families. which would mean that either their child had already died or would be neglected and potentially die, certainly be malnourished, in the service of the richer child, which is this kind of...
it's really fascinating.
I mean, it's a very clear kind of transaction that's happening
and
there.
Actually,
but now,
like when you
what's the
unpick
thing
the research,
in shops that has the security tag on it in every supermarket? It's formula
I don't,
milk,
you know,
right?
and people talk about sort of outcomes for sort of formula-fed babies versus breastfed
like
babies, and with formula, because formula is so, it's like how much of it is that down to people not being able to afford to make formula properly, and that's a huge issue as well because it's so expensive. It's such a huge part of you know, people's budget that it is, you know, that encourages kind of risky, unsafe use. So again, that is a sort of a huge problem as well. Yeah, I went down quite a rabbit hole when I was researching actually about all the kind of 1970s Nestle stuff, and it's so bad. It's like you made babies die by what you did. You know, it's so horrific. And that's sort of, I mean, they're much less blatant about it now, but the profiteering is still and exploitation is still going on.
Battling with formula. So I kind of understand where they're coming from, but from the perspective of a person, that can just cause guilt as well. So it's really, really difficult. Formula, I just think it's a necessary.
Right, like
the historian Emily Bourne, I don't know if you know her work. She's so brilliant. She writes about national milk, so the history of nationalised formula, basically.
Yes. I
write a lot.
Which is really interesting, right? Because it's something that is so profoundly a commodity now. I mean, it was a commodity in a different way, in that it was national milk. So there's this kind of relationship to the British state there that's not uncomplicated. But it was certainly something that was understood to be part and parcel of the kind of welfare state's provision. It's really, I would really recommend her work if you haven't read it. She's a really brilliant historian, particularly kind of about childhood and childcare. But again, it's only very recently, really, that formula milk became such a kind of profitable food.
I wanted in the course of rabbit hole in the course of research. That was my
and actually church. I don't, you know,
back again.
How much of it?
That's a really good question. I think it's an obvious answer, but it's still really the mother blame, actually, as a sort of thread that linked so much. And the mother scapegoat, maybe that's a better word, for so many things. I think that was the thing which I kept coming back to, and something which kind of linked a lot of the rabbit holes I was going down. I mean, there's just so much material, isn't there? That's the thing. And it's, I think one of the things you wrote in your book about the sort of the vastness
kind of
of motherhood,
Nestle,
and I really felt that sense of like, this is so vast, and like, how do you try and kind of wrestle this into some kind of shape? And it was quite sort of late on in the writing process that I came up with the idea of good mother myths. So I was like, oh great, I've got something to organise all this mother blaming
and apartheid, and it's
into a kind of coherent concept. So that really helped actually coming up with that idea.
It isn't necessarily just part of that tissue of history that kind of gets aestheticized sometimes. I mean, particularly the 70s and 80s now, I think we're at a point, and I write a lot about the miners' strike, and, you know, about films like Billy Elliot and Pride, and Billy Elliot the musical, and the ways in which certain kinds of radical history get repackaged as something else, which, in the case of Billy Elliot, I guess actually erases mothers from that film. There's Julia Walters and there's the grandma and the ghost of Billy's mum, but there's no women against pit closures, this group of miners' wives and mothers who were raising money to sustain the strike. And I've gone on a tangent now about Billy Elliot, but I wondered in the course of you know, you mentioned going down a rabbit hole in the course of research, and that was my experience of researching this book entirely. I was just like falling down rabbit hole after rabbit hole into a series of interconnecting warrens.
It's kind of
and I wondered if there was anything else for you that kind of came back again and again in unexpected ways.
generally speaking.
Obvious answer.
I know. I
Very
loved. I loved the Greenham Common. I remember Greenham Common. I'm old enough to remember. I loved Greenham Common and all those rabbit holes you went down. I think were brilliant.
So
yeah, I'm glad you did open up all those boxes in the archive.
The Greenham Common.
Well, I think one of the things you wrote about that sense.
Because of that.
Great.
Lots of
That really
feminist literature at the time that's quite because
Yeah, I thought when I took on the project of writing a political history of motherhood in the UK and the North of Ireland from 1970 to the present, I was like, that seems very contained, pretty small. And then obviously it took me 5 years, and and it's a very long book, I guess, which I didn't expect it to be. But I suppose it's because once you start looking, and particularly archivally, I mean, I spent a lot of time in the Bishopsgate Institute, which has got just unbelievably huge collections, particularly from the 1970s, from the Women's Liberation Movement, from Greenham Common, but also from the Focus E15 Mums Housing Campaign in Newham during the London Olympics, when a group of mums and their children were evicted by the council to make way for the kind of regeneration of that part of London because of the Olympics. There's all of that material in there too. So it is kind of overwhelming because as soon as you start literally in an archive, like opening boxes,
it's a dilemma because that is a cultural force that you could harness in your activism. So do you do it or not? I don't know. It's a really interesting ethical question, isn't it?
Generally speaking, not understood to be particularly important in the kind of, you know, the academy or whatever you want to think of it. Public life.
I loved the comment. I remember Greenham. Loved.
Had I been what kind of letter to be?
Me too. But Greenham Common was interesting in relation to good mother myths. So, I mean, Greenham, right, that the anti-nuclear peace camp in Berkshire on Greenham Common, surprisingly, that lasted for such a long time and was incredibly successful as this radical movement, but also was in conflict with kind of aspects of the feminist movement at the time because of their capitalisation on good mother myths, because of the way they used them. So there's lots of kind of feminist literature from the time that's quite anti-Greenham Common because of its reliance on the long blonde-haired pregnant mother images. I think I'm maybe bastardising that quote, but basically that kind of thing of the way that they kind of centred maternity, but a particularly kind of non-threatening, middle-class, white maternity. Probably a bit sort of crusty, a bit kind of hippie. Say this with respect. Like using that as a way of saying, look, we represent the future because we're mothers, because we're pregnant, because in some instances
no, it's really interesting. I think
and lots of
it was so interesting reading about sort of short start because my oldest is nearly 20. So
the idea
that when I had children, it was around the time of short start. We would go to a children's centre and
these particular forms of
and just the act of vandalism of taking all of that away just makes me so furious.
Ambivalently,
and I think that is
in Greenham Common in a way that I don't think I should fully understood until I started reading all the kind of
parents in the
scholarship
early
around
years
it.
is with universal services like that, and just a place where you can go and get a cup of tea and meet other people in your area, and then if you're concerned about something, there's potentially somebody you can go and talk to. So I experienced Sure Start as a parent, and so your book really made me kind of reflect on that. And I haven't really sort of written about it.
I don't know the answer to that.
in
kind
here,
of reading
but
it, and I guess I have my own kind of.
I think this book took me such a long time to write, so don't ask me for any quick writing tips.
It's always interesting when you.
But I am quite glad that my kids are teenagers
had
now. I kind of, the last chapter, which is about Motherdom, I sort of wrote
whatever.
as the mother of teenagers.
What kind
and
of letter to the editor would
is
I
very
be
different.
penning
It would have been a
in
very
rage,
different last chapter if I'd written it 10 years ago.
I guess,
so I feel, I feel like my own experiences have sort of shaped my understanding where I'm coming from. But I think the other thing is from doing postnatal groups over a period of time and just seeing the same things coming up again and again, that also
kind of exactly halfway through the period,
because it's like this stuff is still, it wasn't just like it was like that when my kids, all this stuff is still happening.
I don't really have any childhood.
And I've written about the intensification of
which is probably
motherhood, this idea that you must be optimising your child, and I just think that's got worse, actually, even worse.
But I kind of remember
my kids were little.
I remember Tony Blair,
and I think it's great on social media. I think there is much more discourse around the sort of difficulties of motherhood, which is great. We've got those kind of digital spaces, but I also feel that the pressures have got greater as well.
Take off my kind of long white beard that I'd put on to pretend to be.
So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I know what you mean about kind of sort of living through that and how that.
But it really was interesting to me to kind of feel myself inside the research in that way. And I mean, you're a mother yourself. You write about that at the very beginning, and then you're kind of going through all of these historical forms of good mother myths.
No, it's really. And it was so interesting reading about sort of. My oldest is 20. When I had children, was around go to children, and just the act of vandalism that way just makes. And I think that is how we should parents in the end is with universal services, like a place where you can go and. So I experienced Sure Start as a parent, and so your book really made me reflect on that. And I haven't really sort of written about in here, but I think this book took me such a long time to ask me for any. But I am quite glad that my kids are teenagers. I kind of the last chapter. Very different chapter. Yeah, I feel like my own shaped my. But I think the other thing is from doing time and just seeing that also, like this stuff is still. It wasn't just like it was like that. All this stuff is happening. I've written about the intensification of motherhood. This worse, actually, even worse than when. And I think it's great on social media. Motherhood, which is great. We've got, but I also feel pressures have got. That answers your question, but I know what you mean about kind of that and.
And I guess, the experience of being, your relation to the state changes as the state changes, right?
Yes.
And your relation to history changes as time goes on, and everything is interconnected and relational in that way.